The office was still half dark when Grace Miller pushed the glass door open with her shoulder, her son asleep against her chest. The city outside was waking up, buses sighing, coffee machines hissing, but inside, everything felt fragile. Her heels echoed too loudly on the tile, each step a quiet apology she didn't know how to say. She adjusted the worn backpack on her arm, kissed the soft curls at her son's temple, and whispered, "Just for today, okay?" She didn't know this moment would cost her everything or quietly begin to give it back. Before we go any further, I'm curious, where are you listening to this from right now? A kitchen table, a night shift break room, a quiet bedroom with the lights off? Share your place in the comments. It's humbling how one story can travel so far. Grace worked as a junior accounts clerk in a mid-sized marketing firm. The kind of job that barely noticed you when things went right and blamed you quickly when they didn't. She was never late, never complained, never asked for favors. But life had a way of testing people who stayed quiet. 3 weeks earlier, her childcare had fallen apart. Her sister's sudden hospitalization. No backup plan. No emergency savings. Just a choice between leaving her 6-year-old son, Ethan, alone, or risking everything. So she brought him. That first morning, she tucked him under her desk with a coloring book and headphones. He was good, too good. Didn't speak unless whispered to. Didn't move unless she nodded. Every time someone passed, Grace's heart jumped in her throat. By day 3, someone noticed. By day 5, she was called into HR. The meeting was brief, clinical, no yelling, no raised voices, just policy, liability. We understand you're in a difficult situation, Grace, but rules are rules. Her manager didn't meet her eyes. She packed her desk in silence. Ethan clutching her coat sleeve, confused but quiet. As they stepped out into the cold afternoon, Grace felt something heavier than shame settle in her chest. Fear. Rent was due. Her fridge was nearly empty. Her phone buzzed with reminders she couldn't answer. That night, she cried into her pillow so her son wouldn't hear. The days that followed blurred together. Applications, rejections, automated emails that all sounded the same. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. She stopped opening them after a while. Then, a week later, her phone rang. It was the company. They were under new management. Temporary restructuring. "We'd like you to come in tomorrow morning," the voice said. There's been a change. Grace didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she dressed carefully. Same warm blazer. Same scuffed shoes. Ethan stayed with a neighbor. A small mercy she clung to like air. When she walked back in the office, everything looked the same. But it felt different. People whispered. Smiles were tighter. The boardroom door was open. Inside, a man stood by the window. Tall, calm, early 40s. He turned as she entered. "Grace Miller," he said gently. "Thank you for coming." She nodded, hands clasped, ready to apologize for everything. For breaking rules, for being weak, for being a mother who ran out of options. But before she could speak, he looked at her, really looked, and something unreadable crossed his face. "I want to hear your story," he said. And for the first time since she'd been fired, Grace felt like someone might actually listen. Grace sat down slowly, the chair cold beneath her palms. The man introduced himself as Michael Reeves, the firm's new director. His voice wasn't sharp like the others she remembered. It carried patience, as if time bent slightly when he spoke. "Start wherever you need to," he said. She hadn't planned what to say. Words came anyway. About her sister. The hospital calls at midnight. The daycare that shut its doors with one apologetic email. About counting coins on the kitchen counter and realizing there were no good choices left. Only less cruel ones. "I never meant to break policy," Grace said, eyes fixed on the table. I didn't know what else to do." Michael didn't interrupt. He didn't glance at his watch. He listened like each sentence mattered. When she finished, silence settled. Not awkward, but heavy. Grace braced herself. Instead, Michael exhaled quietly and said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." That was the first kindness. Small, simple, but it cracked something open in her chest. If you were sitting across from Grace right now, hearing this, what would you have done? Would you have defended her or stayed silent like everyone else? Tell me honestly in the comments. And if this moment stirred something in you, tap like, Sometimes that's how empathy shows itself. Michael folded his hands. When I took this role, I reviewed recent HR actions, he continued. Your case stood out. Grace's stomach tightened. I won't pretend policies don't matter, he said. But context matters more. He paused, then added, especially when a child is involved. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was her termination notice, and beneath it, a new document. A reinstatement offer. Same position. Better hours. Remote flexibility. Childcare support stipend. Grace stared, afraid to blink. I don't understand, she whispered. Michael leaned back, eyes drifting to the window. Years ago, he said, my mother worked 2 jobs. One day, she brought me to her office because she couldn't afford a sitter. Someone complained. Grace's breath caught. She was fired that afternoon, he said softly. No warning. No conversation. He looked back at her then. I was that kid. The room seemed to tilt. Grace's vision blurred. Michael continued. That moment followed me my whole life. I promised myself, if I ever had the power, I'd do better. Tears slipped down Grace's face before she could stop them. Not loud, not dramatic, just relief finally finding a way out. They finalized paperwork quietly. No applause, no announcement, just dignity. When Grace left the building, her phone buzzed. A message from a neighbor. Ethan's asking when you'll be back. She smiled through tears. That evening, she picked him up and hugged him longer than usual. He squirmed, laughing. Mom, you're squeezing too hard. I know, she said. I just missed you. But as the days passed, something else settled in her mind. The memory of how easily she'd been erased before Michael arrived. How many others hadn't been lucky enough to be seen. She started noticing things. The intern who stayed late every night. The receptionist who skipped lunch. The single father in IT who took calls from school nurses in the hallway. Grace began offering small kindnesses, covering shifts, sharing resources, listening. She didn't announce it. She just remembered what it felt like to be invisible. Have you ever had someone step in for you when everything felt like it was falling apart? If yes, write yes and share their name. Honoring them keeps their kindness alive longer than they know. One afternoon, weeks later, Grace was called into the same boardroom again. This time, Michael wasn't alone. HR sat beside him. A stack of files waited on the table. We're launching a family support initiative, Michael said. Flexible schedules. Emergency childcare. No punishment for choosing your child. Grace felt her throat tighten. And I want you, he added, to help lead it. Her first instinct was fear. The second was gratitude. The third, responsibility. She nodded. I'd be honored. As she walked back to her desk, the office buzzed differently now. Not louder, just warmer. Like something had shifted beneath the surface. But not everyone welcomed the change. Across the room, her former manager watched her closely, jaw tight, eyes unreadable. And Grace didn't yet know that the kindness she was helping build would soon be tested in ways that would force her to choose between justice and forgiveness. The tension didn't show itself all at once. It slipped in quietly, the way discomfort usually does, through silences that lingered too long and smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. Grace felt it most in meetings. Her former manager, Linda, sat straighter whenever Grace spoke, fingers tapping the table as if counting mistakes that hadn't happened yet. Linda had followed the rules. Always had. And rules, in her mind, were what separated order from chaos. Grace's return, and worse, her sudden influence, felt like a crack in something she'd built her identity around. At first, Linda challenged ideas politely. Isn't that too lenient? Won't people take advantage? Michael answered calmly every time. Data, studies, human outcomes. Grace stayed quiet, choosing listening over arguing. She knew what it felt like to be dismissed. She didn't want to become the person who did the dismissing. But resentment doesn't need volume to grow. One morning, Grace arrived early and found a note on her desk. No name. Some of us didn't get special treatment. Her hands trembled as she folded it. Not because she felt guilty, but because part of her understood the pain behind it. Scarcity made people cruel. Fear made them compare wounds. At lunch, she sat alone in the small park across the street. watching parents hurry past with strollers, phones pressed to their ears. She wondered how many invisible battles walked by her every day. That afternoon, the intern she'd noticed before, Ava, barely 22, knocked softly on Grace's cubicle wall. "Do you have a minute?" Ava asked, eyes darting around. Grace nodded and followed her to the stairwell. "I heard about the new program," Ava whispered. "My mom's sick. I don't want anyone to think I'm unreliable if I ask for time off." Grace didn't offer policy language. She didn't quote handbooks. She just said, "You're allowed to be human here." Ava cried, fast, embarrassed tears, and hugged her before she could stop herself. That was the moment Grace realized something important. Kindness didn't spread through announcements. It spread person to person, quietly, like warmth through a wall. "Now it's your turn." Pause for a second. What's one small good thing you've done for someone recently, even if no one noticed? Write it below. Your story might remind someone reading that goodness still exists in ordinary places. The program launched officially 2 weeks later. Emails went out. Posters went up. Michael spoke at the all-hands meeting about dignity, not productivity. Applause followed, hesitant at first, then growing. But Linda didn't clap. After the meeting, she cornered Grace near the elevator. "You know," Linda said tightly, "when you blur boundaries, you invite chaos." Grace met her gaze. "Or compassion." Linda scoffed. "You got lucky. Not everyone does." The elevator doors closed between them. That night, Grace lay awake, Ethan asleep beside her, one small arm thrown across her chest. She replayed the conversation again and again. Was she naive? Was she building something that couldn't last? The answer came sooner than she expected. A month later, a major client complained. Loudly, publicly. They'd seen an employee's child in the background of a video call, a toddler giggling, waving at the camera. The client called it unprofessional. Linda seized the moment. "This is exactly what I warned about," she said in an emergency meeting. "We're risking contracts." Michael listened, expression unreadable. Grace's pulse thundered in her ears. She thought of the toddler, the parent, the panic that must have followed that call. Michael finally spoke. "Let me handle this." The next day, the client withdrew half their business anyway. Panic rippled through the office. Whispers returned. Eyes turned toward Grace, not accusing, but afraid. She stood in the restroom later, gripping the sink, staring at her reflection. Was her story about to repeat itself? Had her presence cost others their jobs? When she stepped out, Michael was waiting by the hallway window. "They're blaming you," he said gently. "And me." She swallowed. "I'll resign if I have to." Michael shook his head. "No, this is where it matters." The board meeting was brutal. Numbers, projections, risk analysis. Linda spoke at length about discipline and precedent. When it was Grace's turn, she didn't defend herself. She told the truth. She spoke about fear, about parents choosing between income and presence, about children learning early whether the world would make room for them. She finished quietly. "If we lose money but keep our humanity, I think that's still success." Silence followed. One board member cleared his throat. Another looked down. The vote passed, narrowly, to keep the program. Grace walked out trembling, unsure whether to laugh or cry. But she didn't see Linda watching from the doorway, something shifting behind her guarded eyes, something that would soon bring the story to its most painful turning point. Linda didn't speak to Grace for days after the board meeting. No clip comments, no sharp glances, just absence, which, somehow, felt heavier than hostility. Then one evening, long after most desks had gone dark, Grace noticed a light still on in Linda's office. Papers were scattered everywhere. Not organized chaos, real chaos. The kind that came from someone trying to hold too many things together alone. Grace hesitated at the door. She could walk away. She should, maybe, but something tugged at her, the same instinct that once made her tuck a coloring book under a desk. "Linda," she asked softly. Linda startled, then quickly wiped her eyes. "I'm busy." Grace didn't move. "You don't look it." For a moment, Linda's mask held. Then it cracked. "My son's school called today," Linda said, voice flat. Again, Grace stepped inside slowly. "He's been acting out," Linda continued. since the divorce. She laughed once bitterly. I tell parents to follow rules for a living, and I can't even fix my own child. The room felt smaller. Grace sat across from her, not as a program lead, not as a threat, just as another parent who knew the weight of loving someone you couldn't fully protect. You're not failing him, Grace said. You're just tired. Linda's shoulders slumped. The words landed harder than any argument ever could. They talked for a long time that night, about court schedules and guilt and the strange loneliness of being the responsible one. When Grace finally left, Linda said quietly, I didn't hate you. I hated that you reminded me of everything I didn't allow myself. If that admission hits something tender in you, leave a red heart in the comments. Some truths don't need words. They just need to be felt. The next week, Linda requested flexible hours. No announcement. No explanation. Grace approved it without comment. The shift was subtle but real. Emails softened. Meetings grew less rigid. Even Linda's posture changed. Less braced for impact, more open. Then came a call that stopped everything. Grace was in the grocery store when her phone rang. The hospital. Her sister's condition had worsened. She left the cart in the aisle and drove straight there, hands shaking, thoughts racing. Ethan sat in the back seat, unusually quiet, sensing the fear he couldn't name. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and quiet panic. Machines hummed. Her sister's face looked smaller, fragile in a way that terrified Grace. Days blurred. Work emails piled up unanswered. Michael texted once, take the time you need. Bills didn't pause. One afternoon, Grace found Linda sitting in the hospital hallway with a coffee. I remember where you said it was, Linda said awkwardly. I brought forms. And food. Grace broke down. Linda handled logistics with precision, schedules, approvals, extensions. She shielded Grace from pressure without making a show of it. In that hallway, the roles reversed. Be honest, after everything that happened, could you forgive someone who once stood against you? Type forgive if you could, or never if it would still hurt too much. Grace's sister stabilized, slowly. The crisis eased, but the exhaustion lingered. When Grace returned to work weeks later, she found a small plant on her desk. A note attached, in Linda's handwriting. Rules keep order. People give it meaning. Grace smiled through tears. The company grew. Not explosively, sustainably. Clients who stayed were loyal. Employees stopped whispering and started trusting. At the end of the year, Michael called Grace and Linda into his office together. I'm stepping back, he said, and I want both of you to take this forward. Together. Grace looked at Linda. Linda nodded once. Outside, snow fell softly on the city. Grace picked up Ethan from school early that day. They walked home hand in hand, breath puffing in the cold. Mom, Ethan asked, do you like your job now? Grace squeezed his hand. I love what it's become. And she knew the hardest part of the journey was behind her, but the meaning of it was only just beginning to unfold. The first real test of everything they'd built came quietly, without warning, without drama. It was a Tuesday. Ordinary. Gray. Grace was reviewing reports when Linda appeared at her desk, face pale. We need to talk. Now. Inside the conference room, Michael's old chair sat empty at the head of the table. A reminder that leadership, once given, didn't come with guarantees. Linda closed the door. There's been a complaint, she said. Anonymous. Grace felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Someone claims the family support program is being abused, Linda continued. They're demanding an external audit. Grace exhaled slowly. Let them audit. Linda nodded. I agree. But there's more. She slid a folder forward. Inside were timestamps, access logs, and a name Grace recognized instantly. Ava, the intern. She's been adjusting her hours beyond what's approved, Linda said carefully. Covering hospital visits. Missing deadlines. Grace closed her eyes. She remembered the stairwell. The whispered fear. The promise that it was okay to be human. Has anyone talked to her? Grace asked. Linda shook her head. I wanted to come to you first. They called Ava in that afternoon. She sat small in the chair, hands clenched in her lap. My mom's chemo got worse, Ava said quickly, voice trembling. I didn't want to lose this job. I thought if I worked late, if I didn't ask again. Grace felt the weight of leadership settle fully on her shoulders. Policies existed for a reason. Compassion without structure could collapse. Structure without compassion crushed people. She looked at Linda. Linda looked back, not defensive now, but searching. They gave Ava options. Real ones. Adjusted expectations. Temporary leave. Support. No punishment. Ava sobbed with relief. The audit came and went. The program held. But Grace knew something deeper was happening. Something quieter than policy battles or board votes. People were watching. They watched how mistakes were handled. How power responded to vulnerability. How often kindness held its ground when fear knocked loudly. One evening, long after everyone left, Grace sat alone in the office. Lights dimmed, city glowing beyond the windows. She thought about the version of herself who once packed a box in silence, fired without being heard. She wished she could tell that woman what was coming. If you believe love still wins, even slowly, imperfectly, comment the men. Sometimes hope needs to be spoken out loud to stay alive. Winter passed. Spring crept in. The company began receiving letters, handwritten ones. Parents thanking them. Employees saying they stayed when they would have quit. Children drawing pictures of parents working at laptops beside them. Grace kept them all in a drawer. On the anniversary of her firing, she almost forgot the date. Until Michael emailed. Proud of you. Both of you. She forwarded it to Linda. Linda replied with a single word. Us. That afternoon, Grace left work early and picked Ethan up from school. He ran toward her, backpack bouncing, grin wide. Mom, we learned about heroes today. Grace laughed. Oh yeah? What kind? The quiet kind. Ethan said. The ones who help and don't get famous. Grace stopped walking. She knelt and hugged him, breathing in the smell of crayons and fresh air. In that moment, she understood something she'd been chasing without knowing it. Redemption wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with applause. It arrived in ordinary days made gentler. As they walked home, hand in hand, Grace looked up at the sky, wide, patient, forgiving. And she hoped that somewhere, someone watching this story would feel a little less alone, knowing that even after being dismissed, unheard, or pushed aside, kindness could still circle back, stronger, wiser, and shared. Summer arrived quietly, stretching the days longer, softening the edges of everything it touched. Grace noticed it in the mornings first, sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor as Ethan ate cereal, talking about school projects and made-up superheroes. There was less rushing now, less fear hiding behind routine. She still worked hard, but the work no longer felt like a tightrope over an endless drop. At the office, the changes had settled into muscle memory. Parents blocked calendars for school pickups without apology. Video calls occasionally featured a child's laugh or a baby's cry, and no one flinched anymore. Productivity didn't collapse like critics had predicted. If anything, people stayed later when they could, because they wanted to. One afternoon, Grace overheard a new hire say, I chose this place because I heard they treat people like people. She turned away before the emotion reached her face. But growth always attracts pressure. A larger corporation expressed interest in acquiring the firm. The offer was generous. Life-changing money. Expansion. Prestige. The condition came buried in fine print. Restructuring. Standardization. Elimination of non-essential internal programs. The Family Support Initiative. Grace, Linda, and the board sat in silence as the lawyer explained it. This is how scale works, he said. You can't personalize empathy. Linda's jaw tightened. Grace felt that old familiar ache, the one that came when humanity was labeled inconvenient. They asked for time. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. Ethan's breathing rose and fell beside her, steady and safe. She thought about the parents who would lose flexibility. The ones who would be right back where she'd been, choosing between rent and presence. In the morning, she met Linda early at a cafe. Be honest, Grace said quietly. If we say no, could we survive it? Linda stirred her coffee. It will be harder, slower. She looked up. But yes. Grace nodded. At the board meeting, Grace spoke last. We can sell, she said. Or we can stand. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't beg. She told them about Ethan. About the letters in her drawer. About Ava, now thriving, her mother in remission. About Linda, sitting in a hospital hallway with food instead of judgment. This isn't a perk, Grace finished. It's a promise. And promises only mean something when keeping them costs you. The vote was not unanimous, but it was enough. They declined the offer. The press never covered it. No headlines. No awards. But something else happened. Word spread. Talented people applied, not for salaries but for values. Clients aligned themselves openly, proudly. The firm grew in ways spreadsheets couldn't predict. Months later, Grace stood on a small stage at a community event, invited to speak about leadership. She almost said no. She hated spotlights. But she went. She told her story plainly. No polish. No heroics. Afterward, a woman approached her, holding a toddler on her hip. "I was fired last year," the woman said, voice shaking. "For the same reason you were. I thought, maybe I'd try again. Somewhere." Grace took her resume. "We're hiring." The woman cried. Right there. If you believe love still wins, even when it's slower, quieter, and harder, comment, men. Let this space fill with hope. Someone reading right now might need to see it. That evening, Grace walked home later than usual. The sky was streaked with orange and blue, the city humming below. She felt tired, deeply, but not empty. At home, Ethan waited up, building something out of blocks. "Look," he said proudly. "It's an office." Grace smiled. "Yeah. There's a desk for you," he added, "and a couch, so parents can sit when they're sad." Grace's throat tightened. She lay beside him as he drifted off, blocks still scattered on the floor. She thought about cycles, how pain could repeat or transform. Not everyone got a Michael. Not everyone got a second chance handed back gently. But maybe, just maybe, they could build systems where second chances weren't miracles, just part of how things worked. Grace closed her eyes, knowing the story wasn't ending yet. The hardest lesson, the one about why kindness must be chosen again and again, even when it hurts, was still waiting to be spoken aloud. The lesson arrived on an ordinary morning, the kind that never announces itself. Grace was pouring coffee when Linda called. Her voice was steady, but too careful. "Can you come to my office?" Grace knew before she reached the door. Linda's hands were folded the way they'd been the night, everything first unraveled, controlled, practiced, holding something back. "I need medical leave," Linda said. Immediately, the words landed softly, but their weight bent the air. "It's my son," Linda continued. "He tried to hurt himself last night." Grace didn't speak. She crossed the room and sat beside her. "He told me he feels invisible," Linda whispered, "that I'm always fixing things for everyone else and never him." The irony was cruel. Grace thought of the early days, Linda defending rules like armor, control as survival. She reached for Linda's hand. "You're not alone," Grace said. "Not this time." Linda broke. The weeks that followed were quiet ones. No meetings, no strategy sessions, just presence. Grace took on more responsibility without announcement. Others stepped up without being asked. Meals appeared on Linda's doorstep. Notes from coworkers. Small gestures stitched together into something that held. The company didn't fracture. It slowed, and in slowing, it proved what it had become. One afternoon, Grace visited Linda's home. The curtains were open. Sunlight warmed the room. Linda's son sat on the couch, sketching silently. Grace didn't offer advice. She just sat on the floor and built something out of blocks with him. No agenda. No fixing. Later, as Grace stood to leave, Linda said quietly, "You were right." "About what?" Grace asked. "That rules matter," Linda said. "But love is what teaches us when to bend them." Weeks later, Linda returned, changed. Softer. Braver. No longer hiding behind certainty. At the next all-hands meeting, Linda spoke. "I used to believe strength meant never breaking," she said. "I was wrong. Strength is letting people see you fall and trusting they'll help you up." The room was silent. Then someone clapped. Then another. Grace watched from the back, heart full. If you believe love still wins, even after fear, even after breaking, comment amen. Let hope echo here. Someone watching right now might be holding on by a thread. That night, Grace walked home alone. The city lights shimmered. She thought about cycles again. How pain passed forward or stopped with one brave choice. She reached her apartment door and found a small envelope taped to it. Inside was a child's drawing. Stick figures. One taller, one smaller, holding hands in front of a building with big windows. On the back, in careful handwriting, "Thank you for not giving up on my mom." Grace pressed the paper to her chest. She didn't cry. She breathed, because the story had never been about losing a job or getting it back. It was about what happens when people decide that kindness won't be conditional anymore. And as Grace stepped inside, she knew the final truth, the one that would stay with her long after titles and offices faded, was ready to be spoken. Grace woke before dawn, the apartment quiet except for the soft hum of the city outside. Ethan was still asleep, one arm flung over his pillow, hair sticking up in every direction. She stood in the doorway longer than usual, watching him breathe, letting the ordinary miracle of it settle into her bones. Somewhere along the way, fear had loosened its grip. Not vanished, just softened, like a scar you forget about until the weather changes. She made coffee and sat by the window as the sky slowly lightened. She thought about the version of herself who once stood in an office hallway, holding a cardboard box, believing that one mistake, one human need, had defined her worth. She wished she could tell that woman something simple. This isn't the end. It's the beginning of who you become. At work, the day unfolded gently. No emergencies, no crises, just people doing their jobs and caring about one another while they did. Grace walked through the office, exchanging smiles, stopping to listen, noticing how natural it all felt now. What had once required courage now felt like culture. In the afternoon, a young man waited nervously outside her office. New hire, early 20s. "I heard you're the person to talk to," he said. "My dad's sick. I just want to know, is it really okay to ask for time?" Grace didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said. "It is." The relief on his face was immediate, almost disorienting. That evening, Grace picked Ethan up from school. They walked home slowly, stopping for ice cream, even though it wasn't planned. "Mom," Ethan said between bites, "do you remember when you lost your job?" Grace paused. "I do. I was scared," he said. "But you didn't stop being nice." Grace knelt in front of him, eyes level. "Being kind doesn't mean we aren't scared," she said. "It means we choose not to let fear decide who we are." He nodded, thinking deeply in the way only children do. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, Grace sat at the kitchen table and opened the drawer where she kept the letters. She reread a few words of gratitude, of survival, of quiet hope. She realized something then. The new boss hadn't saved her. He had reminded her of who she already was. The power hadn't been in the title or the decision or the reinstatement. It had been in the choice to stay kind when the world told her to harden. If this story moved you, don't scroll past quietly. Tap like, "Not for me, but for the people who carried this kind of pain and still chose compassion." One click can be your way of saying, "I felt you. You mattered." Grace closed the drawer and turned off the light. Life didn't become perfect after that. There were still hard days, still moments of doubt, still losses that couldn't be rewritten. But something fundamental had shifted. Grace no longer measured success by approval or security alone. She measured it by this. Did she make room for humanity today? Because jobs could be lost, titles could change, even power could disappear overnight. But the way you treat someone at their most vulnerable, that stays. And somewhere, years from now, a child might grow up remembering not the rules that were enforced, but the kindness that made space for them to exist. Grace lay beside her son, the city breathing around them, and let that truth settle like warmth after a long winter. Not every story gets a second chance. But when one does, it's never just about getting something back. It's about choosing to pass it forward.